Hi, my
Hi.
name is Karsten, and with me is David Berg, who is clinical professor of psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. David's special interests in groups and intergroup relations have made him a real sought-after expert on organizational behavior and group dynamics. Thank you very much, David, for being here today with us.
You're welcome.
I read your paper on followership in organizations, where you highlight the symbiotic relationship between leaders and followers. David, in this high-paced world that is so obviously interconnected on so many levels, please share with us why it is so important that we change the way that we think and feel about followership and leadership.
My view is that what we have chosen to ignore at our peril is the imperfections of people in any roles that exist in organizations. The imperfections of all of us that we bring to those roles actually turn out to be an opportunity, because the imperfections highlight the interdependence that we have on other people in our organizations, and particularly in hierarchical relationships. It turns out that we tend to promulgate the thesis that people in leadership roles need to be perfect, or they need to be larger than life, when in fact my experience is that it's precisely the limitations naturally existing in all of us, the limitations of people in leadership roles, that point to our interdependence with those who work for us, with us, even in hierarchical relationships.
Excellent. Well, it seems that individuals and groups oftentimes decide not to cooperate, even if it seems that this would be doing them very good. So it seems that they are caught in what people call the prisoner's dilemma. How can your work help organizations and society at large to learn how to collaborate more effectively?
Well, it turns out I think it's not a terribly difficult thing to do if one begins to probe more deeply into the, as I mentioned before, the interdependence that even groups have with each other. Again, in my experience and in the evolution of modern organization has come to mean a kind of specialization. We specialize in particular functions or activities and thereby are able to intensely develop those specializations. But sometimes we lose sight of the fact that the specialized aspects of organizations need coordination and dependency upon each other. So in healthcare, for example, we can lose sight of the fact that the doctors depend on the nurses and vice versa, that the techs are just as important are important to the delivery of healthcare as is the physician's assistant. We can lose sight of those interdependence, thinking that all we need is one part of this highly specialized activity. In fact, the interdependence is a result of our increased specialization, all to the good, because the increased specialization leads to people who are very good at a specialized thing. But if we don't learn to coordinate, whether it's in healthcare or in industry or in services to families and children, then the potential for that specialization is lost when we lose track of the interdependence of the parts.
So you speak about interconnection between groups and individuals. So what role does an individual actually play in helping others to rethink their responsibilities and to find ways and means to tackle the growing economic and societal problems that we're facing?
This is a question which, depending on who you ask, you get different answers. I think of myself as actually more of a crafts person than an engineer. So my answer is going to be, what can the individual do in his or her relationships with others, which is not what can he or she do to change society and systems. My view of the way in which society changes is through the actions and interactions of each individual. So I'll give you a concrete example. One thing that each individual could do is, when they have a reaction to another, either at work or in their social world, that where the internal reaction is, gee, that's nothing like me. is instead to stop and reflect and say, what part of me is represented in that other? So, for example, when we see cruelty happen in the world, our reflex is to break down our connectedness, is to say, I am not like that. I am not cruel. I am not greedy. I am not judgmental. One step that each individual can do is to reflect on the ways in which they are connected, especially to the abhorrent behavior of others. It's easy to see ourselves connected to the good behavior of others or to the struggles of others, because we all have struggles. But one way to develop our capacity to connect with others, to see our connection, is to reflect on the ways when we initially our reaction is to disown or push away the other, is to search for the part of the self that the other represents.
Fascinating. Do you know of any good practices of individuals or groups who have actually successfully overcome the divide and who are now successfully collaborating?
So when you asked me this question in preparation, I thought of two examples, one in education and one in industry. So the educational example is from a colleague of mine named Ken Smith, who, when doing a simulation, a business simulation, created the role of Chief Reflective Officer. So what he did was each of the simulated senior executive teams had a marketing person and a manufacturing person and a chief executive officer, and they also had a chief reflections officer. And periodically in the simulation, the job of the chief reflective officer was to be that part of the system which looked at the system, which looked at the connections, how the system was working, how the actions of each individual were affecting the behavior and actions of others. So that's one. I think you could take that to an organizational level, but I've seen it work in an educational level where that began to change the group that was working on the simulations, interactions with each other. They became more aware of their connections to each other because of the institutionalized role of the Chief Reflections Officer. So that's one. The other example that's always been a bit of a beacon to me is the example of British Airways about 20 years ago, who was faced with an economic downturn and needed to reduce their headcount by something like 30%. And what they did was they stood in front of their employees and they said, we need to reduce our headcount by 30% and no one is going to lose their job. Now, on the face of that, that's a crazy statement. That's a paradox. That's two opposite statements. What they essentially meant was, working together, we will find a way to reduce headcount where nobody is coerced into losing their job. And so what happened was this released the energy of the organization to work on this problem because the individual insecurities were removed and the collective energy was brought to bear on solving this collective problem, a little like the prisoner's dilemma you referred to. And what they ended up doing was, through lots of management, labor, worker collaboration, they were able to piece together early retirement, retraining programs, greater efficiencies, so that they were actually able to reduce their headcount by pretty close to the objective that they saw. That to me has always been an inspiration.
Excellent. Two really good examples. Well, thank you very much, David, for doing this with us. I'm sure that our viewers will enjoy and find very useful your ideas and your answers. Thank you very much and have a great day.
You're welcome. My pleasure.